On today's World Insight, Biden marks 100 days as president. How successful has his administration been on the home front and on its engagement with China?
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Headway. April the 30th marks the 100th day U.S. President Joe Biden took office. In his address before Congress, he said, "America is on the move again." Facing a deeply divided nation, Biden made some ambitious promises, and he has made headway so far.
100 days since I took the oath of office and lifted my hand off our family Bible and inherited a nation, we all did, that was in crisis. The worst pandemic in a century, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War. Now, after just 100 days, I can report to the nation, America is on the move again.
The U.S. rejoined the Paris Climate Accord agreement on day one. Then he hosted the Leaders Summit on climate, hoping to regain the nation's global leadership on climate action. He also signed a $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief package targeting at unemployment reform and vaccine distribution. While his domestic policies emphasized unity, his diplomacy, though, especially with China, has been confrontational.
And we're falling behind the competition with the rest of the world. China and other countries are closing in fast. We have to develop and dominate the products and technologies of the future.
How would the American public rate Biden's performance in his first 100 days? What will be the administration's focus moving forward? And in particular, where is the China-U.S. relationship headed? Let's loop in our panelists. For 100 days of Biden's presidency in Boston, Robert Ross, associate from John King Fairbanks Center with Chinese Studies with Harvard University in Washington, D.C., Peter Kusnik, professor of history at American University in Iowa City, Timothy Hagel, professor of political science from University of Iowa. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. 100 days already. How time flies. Professor Hagel, how much a mark would you give President Biden?
50.
Okay. Mr. Kusnik, what about for you?
100, I give him 70.
Mr. Ross, what about for you?
I give him an 85 for domestic and a 70 for foreign.
How are we judging a president? Take a look at what he has achieved. 1.9 trillion for the rescue package regarding to the COVID-19. We also have him getting 200 million Americans vaccinated, possibly later this week. How much though that will be a success compared to his predecessors? He's having fewer legislation, much fewer than Donald Trump, but much more reversal of actions of the previous administration in history of American presidents for the first 100 days. He has many executive orders compared to his predecessor, but we all know executive orders, once changing a presidency, that will be reversed sometimes. So how do you say about his achievement so far? And Mr. Kusnik?
Well, he's only actually passed 7 laws so far.
Yeah.
By this point, Franklin Roosevelt had passed 76 laws. But as you say, he's had more executive orders and more reversals of Trump policy than any previous president. So I don't think we can judge him based on the number of laws that he's been able to pass, because Trump was also not able to pass very many laws by this point. What he's done, though, is he's provided a stable, normal, sane model for leadership. He doesn't tweet from his toilet bowl in the middle of the night and change policy in crazy ways. He doesn't attack and vilify and demonize his opponents. We actually have a press secretary who holds daily press briefings. We've got people in the administration, in the cabinet positions, who are actually trying to run those agencies, not destroy those agencies. He believes in governing. And that's such an important change. After 4 decades of neoliberal policy in this country, we're saying that government is not the solution, government is the problem. I think that Biden is a welcome change, even though in some ways he's been disappointing, but in other ways, pretty successful.
Professor Hagel, Mr. Kuznick is trying to say back to normal is already the biggest success this president has achieved. But should president be judged about being normal or not, or based on the merits that he has achieved?
Well, it's a combination of things, and the criteria that you laid out are good ones. The problem, though, is that you can pick and choose among those.
Yeah.
That pretty much any president is going to have some successes and some failures, regardless of the situation, regardless of the political environment. And this is clearly a tough political environment. There's no question about that. And as much as Professor Kuznick was saying how the Republicans are wanting to make Biden a failed president, well, gee, the Democrats wanted to make Trump a failed president. Aside from all the other problems that Trump was having, the things about the tweeting and all of that, that was certainly given more of an opportunity to criticize Trump in various ways, but also they didn't like his policy, didn't want to give him a win on a variety of legislation in one sort or another.
Yeah.
And so it's not surprising that we're seeing the reverse happening too. Now, of course, you can go back to the Obama administration and say, well, gee, the Republicans were doing that there, but gee, let's go back one more to the Bush administration, and the Democrats were holding up a lot of Bush nominees for various particularly judicial judgeships. So this has been going on for a long time. It's not exactly new. It's just that the intensity has gotten more so. And Biden has to face that. Is he more of a normal, certainly a calmer person? Usually people think that he's a nice guy kind of a thing, and that's certainly a good thing. But on the other hand, how is he approaching the job? Is he getting things done? It's not all about poll numbers and things of that nature. It's going to be some combination of things. And again, whether you like Biden, if you like Biden, you're going to find the positive things. If you don't like Biden, you'll find the negative things.
Very interesting and very true. We got people have shifting polls, right? When you like or do not like a person as the president. Dr. Ross, you're usually quite seasoned in your comments. What would you say?
I'd say 2 things. I don't think we want to be in the position to say everyone does it, because that absolves us the responsibility of saying, is one president better than another?
Yeah.
Not everyone does it with equal vehemence, with equal harm, with equal negative results. Some presidents are better than others. And we should acknowledge that this president is establishing greater leadership, sobriety, gravitas to the presidency that every predecessor before him has established, with the exception of one. And that's Donald Trump. Now, it's a low bar to be better than Donald Trump, but we do have the responsibility to make comparative judgments and not dismiss our responsibility by saying everyone does it.
Okay.
But then second, the way we judge a president is how well he leaves the country at the end of 4 years. And this president has made progress, is pushing an agenda. It's very important for social justice, for repairing the country's infrastructure, but critical to his success at the end of 4 years will be his ability to increase government revenue. Because he will leave the country in worse shape at the end of 4 years if his spending programs succeed through legislation, but he's unable to increase the revenue to pay for it. Then he will leave the economy in worse shape than he found it, and that will be not good for the American people, no matter how good he has done for social justice and spending programs. And so the big fight he has coming, and he understands this and he has laid it out, is to raise taxes on capital gains, to raise taxes on income, to raise taxes on corporations. It's going to be very difficult.
And that will have a lot to do with whether America is quote unquote a decline or not, because it is one thing to say it, narrative, but it doesn't matter. What really matters is what is really America is doing and where it is heading for. On that, we'll have to wait and see, because only time could tell. At this point, nobody knows, not even the president. But what we know now is more foreign policy. People have seen this administration trying to, still sailing with the policies, the space of the policies that the earlier administration created, even many term it as bad diplomacy, but trying to sail upon it to use it as leverage and bargaining chips. With Iran, for example, with DPRK, not to mention it. So how should we see this, the nature of this, new administration in terms of foreign policy?
It's interesting. There's certainly, again, to get back to some extent domestic policy, that Biden is concerned with some of the things Republicans said, and even some Democrats in his own party oppose him. But what you're saying is that perhaps they would like to use what Trump did, but try to take a different approach to it and use that and perhaps say, well, look, Trump was doing this and was, very antagonistic in his approach and was putting sanctions and doing these sorts of things. Now, well, let's try a different approach and then use that as a chip perhaps to backtrack and try to get some gains to say, okay, well, we can maybe take sanctions off this situation
we
if you do this other kind of thing.
We haven't seen much of a different approach. I beg to differ, Professor Hagel, if I can, because it's mainly verbally. We haven't seen action. As you know, in politics, a verbal doesn't really mean anything. So, well, it means a lot every day, but eventually it doesn't mean anything, right? So how should we understand this? Is this mainly narrative this administration invented, but there's no implementation of having a different path compared to the early administration, at least regarding the third party?
Yeah. Well, to that, I guess I would say that to some extent, you don't want to have very fast changes, that seems to create and unsettles a lot of relationships. And that was one of the concerns that people had when Trump came in, that he wanted to change everything right away, was very aggressive in his dealings, and that kind of created this chaos in the foreign policy area. And that upset a lot of people. Now, some people said that that was good, that sometimes you needed to sort of upset the apple cart to a certain extent. Now, Biden may be coming in, and again, it's only been, not 100 days at this point, so he's got to have some time to work this out. And basically saying, okay, well, let's come in, let's change the tone. And once you change the tone, then perhaps you can start to change the policies as well. But if you automatically make quick shifts, again, that may create chaos. Even if it's a shift in the direction you want, maybe it will unsettle others that are on the playing field, my guess.
Dr. Ross, does this president, just be frank here, and this administration has much capability at all in terms of foreign policy? Or it is mainly tied up by domestic politics, that foreign policy is only something that they go to as long as they could create a narrative for favorable conditions inside at home, or to rally the crowd at home?
There are three things here. One, we need to understand that domestic politics, or foreign policy, is rarely, if ever, a major issue in public opinion in rating a president. It tends to be a minor issue in elections, and the American people care far more about social issues, cultural issues today. We have our culture wars, and about the economy. Second, the president may have some constraints from domestic politics, but he also has a far degree of latitude, and he has exercised it. So it would be wrong to say everything he's doing with China, with Russia, simply is to deflect criticism or avoid criticism. He's been quite proactive rather than reactive. But then third, if you look at the administration, this goes back to something you said earlier, we don't see strategists in this administration. We see lawyers, we see problem solvers, we see consensus builders. Rather than a Kissinger, Brzezinski, a Scowcroft, who can take a big picture view and figure out how to address relations among the states in a way that can advance American security. And they seem to perhaps believe more in human rights as the purpose of American foreign policy than American security. And that would be a departure from many past administrations who put security at the forefront of American interests.
What about global governance? That has been the U.S. role, a leading role in global governance since the Second World War. Has this administration been able to, besides narrative, bring some kinds of decency into global governance and also into in rallying the crowd worldwide on some of the global issues? Professor Kuznick.
Biden wrote an article in March of 2020 in Foreign Affairs magazine titled "Why America Must Lead Again." And that's been his approach. You have to remember, Biden's got a long history in terms of foreign policy. He was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for a long time. He has a certain understanding. He was key person in terms of Ukraine policy in the Obama administration. So Biden is not a newcomer in this regard. His idea, though, in terms of global governance, is to rally the Europeans in opposition to Russia and China. So he's tried to push for Germany to block the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in order to punish Russia. He's tried, and even his pivot from the Middle East is largely so that he can focus on Russia and China. So Biden, whereas Trump was a divider when it came to domestic policy, Biden in some ways has been a divider when it comes to foreign policy and the global situation. So I would like to see him become more of a healer and begin to work together in a more positive way globally. When it comes to this question that Robert was raising about Turkey, I mean, the United States is very angry with Turkey right now for implementing the S-400, the anti-ballistic missile system from Russia. And so they're into punishing Turkey right now for some of the things that Turkey's doing. But I agree that we don't have strategists. We don't have deep thinkers, where I might be happy to not have a Kissinger or a Brzezinski. I would like to see a more positive kind of thinker who understands the way all of these different things affect each other, what the relationship is with all these different policies.
Mr. Ross, we see global governance diminishing as a result of the distrust and also many of the other ills as a result of politics earlier. But, you know, whether it's WTO, even the appellate body, is not back on track because U.S. still refused to work on that. We see IMF, World Bank, still functioning or trying to do their job, but, you know, the funding and support they get compared to earlier times could be much smaller. And we also see, meanwhile, NATO still trying to struggle to find its role. You know, there are different kinds of international governance systems that are at a very different stage right now, not necessarily better, let's just say, compared to the earlier administration. So what does that say about this administration's capability of global governance?
I think Professor Kuznets made a strong point that we're not re-entering global multilateral organizations to exercise global leadership for collective goods or global governance, but we see it as a way to compete with China and Russia. And so we're no longer turning to the Europeans and say, what do you want? What can we give you? We're no longer turning to the Japanese or the South Koreans, the Australians, the Canadians. What do you want from global governance? How can we lead? We're going to them and say, we need to cooperate within international organizations to compete against China. And that's a very different context, a very different approach to dealing with global institutions. In part, that reflects less American capabilities to lead. We no longer have the funding. We no longer have an interest in free trade that's declined in American politics. We no longer can use our markets to provide goods to other countries. We no longer can provide economic stability and financial stability given our own economy. And so there's a much less willingness to pay the cost of providing collective goods of global governance and more of an interest in using those institutions as part of a security strategy in dealing with rising China or, yes, to contain China.
Before we go, very briefly from every one of you for this first part of discussion, some suggest we are in the very beginning of a transitional process about the world's order and the players' changes. Others say they disagree. This is only a hiccup in the overall process that we have already seen over the past few decades. Now, no matter which scenario, what role is this administration playing, judging from the first 100 days?
In some ways, I see Biden as being a big thinker when it comes to domestic policy. I see the COVID relief package, the infrastructure plan, his American family plan, as in some ways the most positive domestic policy, certainly since Johnson, and in some ways going back to Roosevelt. But when it comes to foreign policy, he's a very conventional thinker, and he still has this Cold War mindset and us versus them worldview. And I think that's not what's needed now. We've gone from the days when America was the unipolar power and could dictate to the days now when we're in a multipolar world, and we've got to learn to make that transition and make it positively, because the world has serious problems that need global leadership, and the U.S. should be part of that in a positive way.
I hope so. Professor Hagel, also 45 seconds?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that in many respects, Biden himself sort of saw himself as a transitional president, sort of a placeholder to some extent. And there's some question about whether he'll even run for re-election. Right now, of course, you would say yes, simply because you don't want to be a lame duck president.
Yeah.
But it's not clear that he's going to have the longevity. And so we may be looking for the next generation of leaders to sort of stabilize the situation we're in now.
Dr. Ross?
I agree with you that the world is in transition, and I agree we're moving from a post-Cold War American unipolarity or hegemony in maritime Asia to bipolarity. But the Biden administration has taken it upon itself to resist that trend and to try and maintain American supremacy and dominance in Asia. And I fear they're doing so at the cost to American interests and American abilities over the long run.
Well, gentlemen, as we know, in history, many things move on, but slowly, and there are back and forth sometimes. It's very fascinating to talk to you about the general foreign policy of this administration for the first 100 days. Coming up, we're going to discuss more in focus about U.S. China relations with a panelist coming from China also joining in. We'll be back after this. To continue our discussion about the 100 days of Biden's presidency, in Boston, Robert Ross, associate with the John King Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies from Harvard University. In Washington, D.C., Peter Kuznick, professor of history at American University. In Iowa City, Timothy Hagel, professor of political science from University of Iowa. In Beijing, Professor Rong Ying, vice president of CIIS from the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me again. The second part of our discussion mainly is going to be focusing on China and the United States. How do you see, Mr. Ross, 100 days, much achieved or much fight achieved?
In foreign policy, the administration set out to strengthen alliances, create coalitions so as to strengthen American bargaining power around the world, particularly toward China. And on the one hand, the administration worked very hard to strengthen relations with Europe, with Japan, with India, and other countries. But it was clear from the start that many of these countries are not eager to become involved in a U.S. China Cold War. So we saw the Europeans reach an investment agreement with China prior to the inauguration of the president. We've seen the South Koreans distance themselves from the United States. So it's an uphill battle. Even Japan, which agreed to have a visit to Washington, didn't agree to fully what the administration wanted. And on the other side, having tried very hard to have a coalition and to put things in order before meeting with China, it's clear that China was not coerced, or if you will, was not going to be bullied by the United States trying to strengthen its power by strengthening its alliances. And we saw that in a number of ways. The meeting in Alaska, China clearly showed its hand that it was not prepared to simply roll over before American coercive attempts. And of course, Chinese policy in the South China Sea and elsewhere, U.S. China relations and toward Taiwan has not changed, if at all, as the administration has increased its attempts at pressuring China with its Taiwan policy, with the South China Sea. China has responded in kind. So we have to say that on the one hand, the administration has tried to be more coercive with China. On the other hand, it has not been successful.
If I ask you, Mr. Ross, using one word to describe this 100 days with China by this administration, what would you say? What would that word be?
One word would be failure.
Interesting. Professor Rong Ying, what would you say that word?
Possibly two words are not succeed or not successful. Sounds better from the Chinese perspective regarding the administration's policy towards China. Well, I think from the Chinese perspective, if we look at what before the administration and the Biden administration came to power, there are attempts, serious attempts made by the Chinese side that the new administration will do something different, or in Chinese terms, will correct the mistakes. So China had expectations, and China also actually set out an approach how to rectify or how to correct their mistakes. And in other words, there are terms, there are expectations to do that. And unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. But still, I think, as I can see, if you follow the recent speech by State Councilor Foreign Minister Wang Yi with the Council of Foreign Relations, he's still saying that the U.S. has not yet find a correct way to deal with China. In other words, still have expectations, want a stable relationship, no confrontation, no conflict, equality, win-win cooperation. I think the Chinese at the meetings shown and at the statements shown, and I think China would like to develop a stable relationship.
Professor Hagel, there are two kinds of understandings from China. One is many people were awfully surprised by the fact that the Biden administration have not done much in order to repair the already hugely damaged relations between China and the United States, given the fact that these are the two largest economies in the world. The other thing is that many believe that there is a difficulty for the Biden administration to be closer to China, given the internal divisions, and China is not necessarily on the top of the agenda for politics for Biden right now. But many do emphasize still on the significance of this relationship, whether Biden could sacrifice China-U.S. relations for some of the immediate goals that he wants to achieve. Professor Hagel, from a political scientist perspective, particularly working on the U.S. politics, how do you see these two angles seen from the Chinese side?
To the extent that Biden wanted to not be Trump, he wanted to, in his view, repair some of the damage that he perceived Trump did, especially in foreign policy. But that's also true for domestic policy as well. And so Biden has been fighting a political fight on several fronts. You've got domestic problems here in the United States, domestic politics problems as well in the United States. And to some extent, that's put U.S. China relations to some extent in the back burner. And of course, to the extent that Biden wants to, in his view, repair that relationship or change it from under the Trump administration, that he's getting pushback from those on the right, the Republicans, but also a few from his own party as well.
Yeah.
And so for him, it's easier to work on some domestic policies where he's getting full support, mostly from his Democratic colleagues. And in fact, the only time the really Democrats are opposing him is when they think he hasn't gone far enough, that he should go further in terms of some of these things. But Biden also has to deal with a very closely divided Congress in both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate.
Sure.
And so he has to be very careful how he handles that. They're pushing very hard on a number of domestic policies to try to push through what they can while they can, because there's some thought that they, being the Democrats, lose control of Congress in the 2022 elections. So he's got to do what he can now. And to some extent, that means putting U.S. China relations and work towards that to some extent in the back burner.
At the very beginning of the year, the two presidents, China-U.S., talked to each other on the phone, came up with all these important adjectives to describe the relationship and the future directions. Then comes the Anchorage, Alaska drama. Then there is another big event, which is the climate summit, and earlier the discussions between the two special envoys on climate change of the two countries. How do you see these waves of interactions? Are these the most important things? Or are many things that are under the surface much more important than what we are seeing in the public domain? Mr. Ross.
I would look at the recent summit on climate change as not as an example of U.S. China cooperation, actually.
Interesting.
I think we're seeing this as an example of Chinese cooperation with Germany and France. And I don't think it's an accident that President Xi Jinping had a conversation with the presidents of France and Germany before the summit. It would be far too costly to disrespect the United States on the summit, far too costly for Xi Jinping's relationship with Europe. We've seen no Chinese cooperation with the United States on any other issue. So if there are bilateral issues that do not involve Chinese interests anywhere else, I'm afraid we're going to remain in stalemate. We've seen agreement between China and Iran where basically China has supported Iran's resistance to the United States. We're seeing no Chinese-U.S. cooperation on North Korea. We're seeing tension increase in the South China Sea and over Taiwan. We've seen no movement on economic relations, but a strengthening of American resistance to technology cooperation with China under the Biden administration. So the trend, I would suggest, is an unmitigated, unceasing trend toward greater conflict, competition, and hostility, with little room for optimism that we can have cooperation on issues that directly affect U.S.-China relations, or even American interests for that matter.
Very interesting. Mr. Rong, I want to go to you about that.
The Chinese have made very clear what it wants and what kind of cooperation, how the cooperation or coordination would like to be conducted. So in other words, China would like to, by working with the United States, cooperating with the United States, it was looking for, and it was being advocating a stable, certainly as sort of a stable international environment, stable major country relationship.
Stable major power relations. Has China seen that with the United States so far? Your assessment, very briefly.
It's not as sort of common as Chinese sort of thinking, but China has not, I think, lost sort of making, it's not given up.
Okay.
But to do that, that's the second point I will make, is China made it very clear as the past interactions, past 100 years, is that the terms, the way, how to do that, it is not to be dictated by the United States. And China is not going to listen or have the lectures of the United States on any intervention, interfering in internal affairs. So very much clear, it's not a way. We're not going to accept that. And you're not positioned to do that. This is that it's a message, very much clear.
If I could just follow up, Mr. Rong, China seems to believe there is a linkage between or among all the issues that were put on the table by the U.S. side. For example, climate change, economic relationship, political relationship, human rights issue, going to the third party areas and participate and cooperate. All of these are interlinked with one another. But the U.S. side, it seems, trying to emphasize that we can cooperate on one thing, for example, about climate change, while we are competing, if not rivaling against each other, as some in the U.S. would say, in the other areas. Would China accept that? Even if China didn't accept that, it could still be a reality or will China refuse any kind of cooperation if that's not happening? I mean, at least the atmosphere is toxic. There's no way of cooperation. Mr. Rong, what is Chinese thinking?
The big question, I think, for China is the United States is changing, it's changing in a way, has changed its approach in a way that from every and each move, it has been doing from the perspective of containing China or challenging China or whatever, because first and foremost, it has clearly defined China as a strategic rivalry, or in this administration is a strategic, most severe strategic challenges. So this is not the way I think China would like the relation to be defined. But in the meantime, as I said, that at the tactical level, China would be able, I think, can manage a kind of a way to deal with U.S. specific issues. But the atmosphere, the circumstances, and particularly at the political front, where the Biden administration has not changed the approach of attacking China's political system, political interference. This is something I think, in other words, the ideological issue is something China, I think, that would not be accepted as political, because simply it's politically impossible and difficult.
Professor Hagel, that leads us to the next question for you as a political scientist. Has in history the U.S. administration of various ages been successful by using foreign, shall we say, foreign issues as a rallying factor for domestic politics? Will that be successful, particularly sustainably successful? That will have an impact, certainly, on how the Biden administration will, frame the China policy, it seems.
Certainly from a political perspective, if you can have a foreign policy issue that does unite the country in some way, where ordinarily the parties are going to argue about one thing or another, and those things change on a regular basis, and sometimes the parties even switch sides over time. But if you can find something in the foreign policy area that will unite the country, then that gives the current administration more purchase, more ability to put its own agenda in place, whether it's with respect to foreign policy or sometimes the domestic policy will flow from that as well. And it's not clear that that's where we're at right now, for the reasons that the others have already indicated. That right now, if China doesn't feel that it has to listen to the United States, at least not in the same way, doesn't have to abide by what the United States wants to do, which is no surprise there. And if they don't feel that Biden right now, at least, is strong enough to enact what Biden wants to do, that they say maybe saw Trump as being more of a fighter, that was the cliche with Trump. If they don't see that Biden is willing to do that, then potentially that could be an issue. And one reason why China would just like to wait it out and see what's going to happen over time. There's some question, of course, as to whether any U.S. president is going to have a second term. And even if a president has a second term, that's it. And that you have a new president after that. And so, as was indicated, that China often seems to like to play the long game and basically wait out what's going to happen. And maybe to some extent, that's what's happening now.
So, gentlemen, before we go, what would you say to describe this 100 days, comparing President Biden with the other presidents in history? Mr. Kuznick.
In some ways, he's done great domestically. In terms of foreign policy, so far, I'm disappointed.
Mr. Hagel.
I think that right now it's obviously an incomplete, but it's been very mixed, both in terms of domestic and foreign policy.
Mr. Rong Ying.
Yeah, I think he could have done much better if he has a good China policy. So Chinese still have some hope, but we are waiting and see.
Mr. Ross.
I would also give relatively high marks for domestic policy, with the exception of immigration policy, that he's been ambiguous and ambivalent, flip-flopping. But in foreign policy, overly ambitious, disappointing, and thus largely unsuccessful.
Thank you so much for all of you. Robert Ross, Peter Kuznick, Timothy Hagel, Rong Ying. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And that's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching.